First thing you should know about me is that I never wanted to save anybody. I wanted to disappear, and the ocean was the cleanest way I knew to do it. My name is Renata Voss, and 3 weeks before the world stopped answering its phones, I bought a 40-foot fishing boat called the Maribel, with the last of my divorce money, and pointed her bow at a rock in the cold Atlantic that the charts barely bothered to name. Kestrel Island. 14 miles from the mainland, 200 acres of granite and wind-bent spruce, and a Coast Guard station that the government had abandoned in 1987 and forgotten to demolish. I'm telling you this in order, the way it happened. Because if I skip ahead, you will think I knew what I was doing. I didn't. I knew tides, I knew diesel and weather, and how to read a swell before it broke. That was the whole of my expertise. And it turned out to be enough and not enough at the same time, which is the only honest description of survival I can give you. When I first tied up at the station's collapsing pier, I expected ghosts. What I found was concrete. The main building was a squat 2-story block with walls 18 inches thick, built to take a nor'easter on the chin and keep a light burning through it. There was a boathouse, a cistern fed by rain, a rusted generator the size of a refrigerator, and a watchtower with a sweep of glass that looked out on every approach the sea could offer. I stood in that tower the first evening with a thermos of bad coffee and felt something I'd not felt in years. Not happiness, usefulness. The building wanted to be maintained, and I wanted something to maintain. I worked. That was my grief management, and it was efficient. I patched the boathouse roof. I drained and flushed the generator and coaxed it back to a steady cough, then a rhythm. I cleared the cistern of leaves and ran the water through a filter I'd hauled from the mainland. I cut fire breaks in the dead spruce, because a dry island is a candle waiting for a match. I worked from gray light to gray light, and when I slept hard and did not dream. And for the first time since the lawyer's office, I did not hate the inside of my own skull. I want to be clear that none of this was preparation for what came. I wasn't a prepper. I didn't have a theory. I had a place that was already built to survive, and a person who needed to be busy. And the dumb good luck of those two things finding each other at the exact moment the mainland began to come apart. The radio told me first. I kept an old VHF set going in the tower out of habit, the way you leave a light on in an empty house. On my 11th night, I heard the Coast Guard channel out of the mainland station break its calm professional cadence. A voice said the word containment, and then said it again with a question mark behind it. And then a different voice, younger, said something that wasn't procedure at all. It said, "They're getting back up. The ones we put down, they're getting back up." Then static. I sat in the dark with my coffee going cold, and I did the thing I am least proud of in this entire account. I felt relief. Not for them, for me. Because whatever was happening over there, across 14 miles of black water that doesn't care about anybody's emergency. And I was on a rock with concrete walls and a working generator and no one who knew my name. I told myself I would listen one more night and then decide whether the world was actually ending or just having one of its routine nervous breakdowns. I went down to the bunk room and lay in the dark and listened to the wind work the eaves. And I thought, whatever this is, the water will keep it out. I was right about the water. I was wrong about everything that water carries. By morning, the radio had gone from panic to silence, which is worse. Panic means people are still trying. Silence means they've stopped. I climbed the tower with the binoculars my brother had left me, the only thing of his I kept, and I glassed the mainland horizon. Smoke. 3 columns of it, fat and black and leaning east in the wind. The kind of smoke that comes from fuel and not from wood. The marina town of Pell's Harbor was burning, or part of it was, and no one was putting it out. That was when I made my first real decision. And I made it the way I make all my decisions, which is with my hands before my head catches up. I decided the station would hold, not as a fantasy, as a job. I went down to the pier and I started counting what I had against what I'd need, and the counting steadied me the way it always does. I had the Maribel, fueled, plus 200 gallons of diesel in drums I'd barged over for the generator. I had the cistern, which in this climate would never run dry. I had rice and beans and canned protein for maybe 4 months, if I ate like a prisoner, which I intended to. I had the building itself, with its one ground floor door and its windows set high and small the way military builders set windows when they expect trouble. And I had the single greatest defensive feature any survivor could ask for, which was 14 miles of cold salt water that the dead, whatever they were, could not swim. I started fortifying that afternoon. Not against a horde, I didn't believe in hordes yet. Against the possibility of a boat. Because here's the thing the water taught me early. An island keeps out everything except other people who also have boats. And people with boats during the end of the world are not coming to borrow sugar. I welded the ground floor door's hinges with the acetylene rig in the boathouse, then cut and hung a second barrier of steel grating I'd salvaged. I jammed the boathouse's seaward doors and rigged the watchtower so I could see all 3 landing points: the pier, the gravel beach on the south spit, and the flat shelf of rock on the lee side where a small craft could ground in calm weather. I slept in the tower now, in a sleeping bag, with the VHF crackling its empty channels beside me. On the 4th day after the smoke, I saw my first one. It came in on the tide, not under its own power. A body, face down, rolling in the surf at the south spit the way driftwood rolls. And I almost didn't look twice, because the sea brings in dead things constantly. And a corpse from a burning town 14 miles off was grim arithmetic, but not a surprise. Then it stood up. I want you to understand what that does to a person. I was 400 yards away, up in the tower, and I watched a drowned thing that had been rolling in the surf get its feet under it in 2 feet of water, and turn its ruined face toward the land, and start walking up the beach. It moved wrong. Not slow, exactly patient, like it had all the time the dead are famous for having. The salt water sheeted off it, and it didn't shiver, and it didn't gasp, and it didn't do any of the 1,000 small things a living body does when it comes out of cold water. It just walked, dragging 1 foot up the gravel toward the spruce. The water hadn't kept it out. The water had delivered it. I sat down on the tower floor with my back against the cold glass, and I shook. And I let myself shake for exactly as long as it took to count to 60. And then I got up. Because here was the new math, arriving uninvited the way all the real math of my life arrives. If one could come in on the tide, then the tide was not a wall. The tide was a road. And roads, unlike walls, run in both directions. And I'd spent my whole life knowing that, and somehow forgotten it on this rock. It took the dead thing 6 hours to find the building, and I spent every one of them learning how it moved. This is the part where people expect me to describe fighting it. And I'm not going to, because I didn't fight it. I studied it. I'm a fisher, not a soldier. And the only weapon I ever respected is information. It went up into the spruce and got tangled and spent an hour working free of a deadfall, which told me they weren't smart, but they were persistent. And that persistence in a creature that doesn't tire is its own kind of terror. It came down onto the path my own boots had worn between the pier and the building, which told me they followed disturbance, the trampled ground, the scent or the sign of where the living had been. It reached the welded door, and it didn't knock or moan theatrically the way the movies promised. It pressed against the steel and pushed, steadily, with the full, patient weight of a thing that has nowhere else to be. And the door held. And it kept pushing anyway, I dealt with it from the tower with a boat hook and a great deal of nausea. And I will leave the mechanics there, except to say that putting down something that used to be a person is not loud and is not satisfying, and stays in your hands for days afterward like a smell you can't wash out. When it was done, I sat in the tower until the light went, and then I made myself a decision that I would later break, which is the way of all the decisions that matter. I decided I would not bring anyone here. The island worked because it was empty. Every person I let in was a person who could die here and stand back up here, inside my walls. And the whole brutal logic of my safety depended on me being alone. I had come here to disappear. The end of the world had simply made my disappearance permanent. I could live with that. I had been living with versions of it for a year. I held that resolution for 9 days. On the 10th day, a flare went up off the south water, low and orange, and a voice came over the VHF that I had stopped expecting to ever hear again. A woman's voice, tight and exhausted, but not panicked. Professional in a way that made me sit up. Any station, any vessel. This is Pell's Harbor Lifeboat Constance. 4 souls aboard. We are taking water and we have wounded. We have a child. Repeat, we have a child. Requesting any safe harbor, any harbor at all. Over. I sat in the tower with the handset in my hand, and the smoke of my dead brother's binoculars on the table and the entire architecture of my survival hanging on whether I keyed the mic. A child. They'd led with the child because they knew exactly what it would do to whoever was listening. And knowing the manipulation didn't make it work any less. I thought about the welded door and the 4 months of food that became 2 months if I doubled my count, and 3 weeks if I quadrupled it. I thought about how a child can be bitten and turn, and how I would have to be the one to do what came after in my walls, with my hands that already wouldn't come clean. I thought about my brother, who had texted me come up for air, ran 11 days before he put his car into the river, and how I had read it and not answered because I was busy disappearing. I keyed the mic. Constance, this is Kestrel Island Station. I have a pier on the north side. Sheltered, I'll put a light up. Come in slow. The rocks are bad on the approaches you can't see. I'm one person, and I'm armed, and I need you to understand that before you land. I let go of the button, and the silence stretched. And then the woman's voice came back, and it broke just slightly on the first word. And that small break undid something in me that I'd spent a year welding shut. Kestrel, she said, we see your light. We're coming. They came in worse than the radio had let on, the way people always do, because radio is for the version of the truth you can still bear to say out loud. The Constance was a converted lobster boat riding low and wrong, and when I caught her bow line and snubbed it on the cleat, I could see the patch they'd hammered over a hole near the waterline, a cabinet door and a wad of someone's coat, and the bilge pump going steady and losing. 4 souls, the woman had said. I counted them off as they came up onto my pier in the lantern light. The woman herself was maybe 50, square and gray-cropped, with the unhurried economy of motion that tells you someone has worked a boat for a living that turned out to be Marg Ostrander, who'd run the Pell's Harbor Lifeboat volunteer crew for 19 years and had no intention of stopping just because the people she rescued were now occasionally trying to eat her. Behind her came a man in his 30s, with his forearm bound in a strip of bedsheet gone brown, moving carefully, his face the color of the fog. That was David. And then the child, a girl of about 8 in a life jacket 3 sizes too big, holding the hand of a teenage boy who looked like he hadn't slept in a week. The girl was Soto. The boy was her brother, Emmerich. And he was the only one of them who looked at me like I might be a threat instead of a rescue, which told me he was the one who'd kept them alive. That arm, I said to David, before anything else, Before welcome, or I'm Renata, or the kettle's on. I had to know. The whole island had to know. Is that a cut, or is that a bite? The pier went silent, except for the bilge pump and the water and David's breathing. Marg looked at me, and I watched her decide how to answer, and the fact that she had to decide told me everything. It's a cut, she said. Rebar, when the dock went. I've been watching it. It's a cut, Renata. I looked at Emmerich, the boy, because he was the one who couldn't lie to me yet. And Emmerich looked at the planking and didn't say anything. And that was its own answer. And it wasn't the same answer Marg had given. This is the moment I keep coming back to. I want to tell it honestly. I could have turned them away even then. I could have cut the bowline and let the Constance take her chances with the next island or the open sea. The cold thing in me, the thing that had bought a boat to disappear into, ran the numbers fast and clean. An unknown bite, 4 strangers, a sinking vessel, 2 months of food, 1 welded door. The math said no. The math had always said no. My whole life, to my marriage, to my brother's text, to everyone who'd ever needed something from me that cost more than I wanted to spend. But I'd already keyed the mic. I'd already put the light up. You don't get to call a child across 14 miles of black water and then weigh her against a sack of rice when she's standing on your pier. Bring him up to the boathouse, I said. Not the main building, the boathouse. I'll look at the arm in the light, and then we'll all decide together, with our eyes open, what happens next. Marg, you and I are going to have an honest conversation about what "I've been watching it" means. Marg's jaw worked. Then she nodded. Once, the nod of a woman who has run a lifeboat crew long enough to know that the captain who survives is the one who lets herself be told no. We carried David up the path my own dead thing had walked 9 days before. The girl Soto slipped her hand into mine on the way, automatically, the way small children attach to the nearest large, calm adult. And I let her. And I hated how much I needed it. And I understood in that moment that my disappearance was over. Whatever I was now, it had 4 other names attached to it. And one of them might already be dying. In the boathouse, under the work lamp, David's arm told the truth that Marg's mouth wouldn't. I unwound the bedsheet, and the wound underneath wasn't a clean rebar tear. It was a half moon, the unmistakable arc of a human jaw, the skin around it gone the gray-green of a bruise that had stopped being a bruise. David watched my face while I looked at it, and he was the one who said it, quietly, so the children outside wouldn't hear. You don't have to pretend, he said. I know what it is. Margie's been telling everybody it's a cut because she didn't want Soto scared on the boat. But I know. I've known since yesterday. He smiled, and it was the worst thing I'd seen since the dead man stood up in the surf. Because it was a real smile, tired and human and kind. I just didn't want to die in the water. That's all I asked her for, not the water. I have done hard things in my life. I had never sat in a pool of work light with a stranger who just confirmed he was going to become something that would try to kill the rest of us, and had him thank me for the dry land. I didn't have anything to say that wasn't a lie, so I held his good hand, and I didn't say anything. And that was the right call, because some moments are insulted by words. Marg came in then and saw my face and didn't argue. The lying was over. We stepped outside into the dark, where Amric stood guard over his sister with a gaff hook held like a man who'd learned to hold it the hard way. And the 4 of us, who could still make decisions, made one. Here is where I want to be precise, because this is the dilemma the whole island would turn on. David had hours, maybe a day. When he turned, he'd be a danger inside my walls, the exact nightmare I'd welded my door against. The cold math said put him on the Constance, push her off, let the sea take the problem. The decent math said you do not put a conscious, kind, terrified man out on the water to die alone and turn alone. Not after he's told you the one thing he's afraid of is the water. And there was a third math, the one I hadn't expected, the one that changed everything. David said it himself. "Use me," he said. We'd gone back in. He could see we were deciding. "When it happens, you said one of those things came in on the tide and you watched it for 6 hours, and that's how you learned how they move. You don't know how a fresh one moves. You don't know how fast they are in the first hour, whether they remember anything, whether they go for sound or movement or warmth." He had to stop and breathe. "I'm a paramedic. Was. I spent 10 years learning bodies. Let me give you the last useful thing mine's got. Watch me. Tie me where I can't hurt anybody and write down everything I do. It's the only fortification that matters now. And it's the only thing I've got left to fortify it with." I have turned that offer over 1,000 times since, a dying man asking to be made into a textbook. Marg wept. The only time I ever saw her weep. Emmerich from the doorway said, "He's right," in a flat, dead teenager's voice that had already buried too much. We did it. I won't dress it up. We made David comfortable in the boathouse, secured in a way he agreed to while he could still agree. And we kept watch in shifts. And we wrote down what happened in the hours after, in a waterproof logbook that became, in time, the single most valuable object on Kestrel Island. The dead don't sweat, I learned. They go for sound over movement. In the first hour, they're nearly as fast as a living person, and then they slow as the body stiffens. A fresh one will track a heartbeat through a wall. David gave us all of it. It was the most generous thing I've ever witnessed, and I built the rest of my survival on the data of his death. We buried what had been David at sea on the third morning, off the lee shelf where the water runs deep, because Marg said he'd been a sailor's son and would want it, and because none of us could stand the idea of a grave on the island where he might, by some logic we no longer trusted, not stay down. Soto threw a sprig of spruce onto the water. Emmerich didn't throw anything. He stood at the rail with his jaw set and watched the sea take the weighted canvas down. And when it was gone, he turned to me and said the first complete sentence he'd offered since landing. "You're going to do this for other people too, aren't you?" he said. It wasn't a question. "Bring them in, now that you've started." I didn't answer him because I didn't know yet, but he'd seen something in me that I hadn't admitted to myself. The welded door was already a fiction. I'd cut it open in my head the moment I keyed the mic. The only question left was how wide. The island settled into something like a life. I taught Marg the generator and the cistern. I taught Emmerich the boat he took to the Maribel, like he'd been born wet. And it gave him something to do with the rage that came off him in waves. Soto attached herself to the watchtower and to me, and became, without anyone assigning it, the lookout, because children are patient and observant, and have nothing they'd rather do than be trusted with something real. We rationed. We worked. The logbook grew, and the dead kept coming in on the tide. That was the rhythm of Kestrel, and I need you to feel how strange it was. We were not besieged. There was no horde at the gate. There was the sea, and every few days the sea delivered another one. Sometimes a drowned mainlander walking up out of the surf, sometimes a thing that had been floating for a week and barely held together. They came singly on the current, at the mercy of tide and wind, and we got good at meeting them at the waterline before they reached the spruce. Because a thing met in the shallows is a problem, and a thing that reaches cover is a hunt. This is the conflict that almost no one understands about an island in the end of the world. The land doesn't attack you. The land is your friend. It's the water, the thing that protects you, that also will not stop handing you the dead. Every tide is a delivery. The same 14 miles of cold salt that kept the living away brought the dead to my beach with the patience of a postal service. I could not stop the sea. I could only meet what it brought. By the fourth week, I'd stopped sleeping more than 4 hours. The work that had once been my medicine had become a treadmill that ran on corpses. And I felt the cold thing in me start to do its arithmetic again. Quieter this time, more reasonable. Which is how it always sounds right before it costs you your soul. 4 people, it said. 4 people and a finite amount of everything. Every tide is a withdrawal from an account you can't refill. You cannot save the mainland. You can barely save this rock. Seal it. Pull the boat. Stop answering the radio. Let the water be the wall it was always supposed to be. I might have listened to it. I want to be honest that I came close. What stopped me wasn't decency exactly. It was Marg, on a gray evening in the 5th week, when we'd just met 2 dead at the South Spit in one tide, and I was sitting in the boathouse with my hands shaking and the logbook open in front of me, doing the cold sums in the margin where I thought no one could see. She looked at the numbers. She didn't tell me I was a monster. She'd run a lifeboat for 19 years. She knew the arithmetic better than I did. She just said, "Renata, a wall that only keeps things out is a grave with a view." We didn't survive Pell's Harbor to live in a nicer-looking version of dying. Then she closed the logbook, gently, over my cold sums, and went to put the girl to bed. The radio gave us the mainland in fragments after that, and the fragments built a picture I didn't want. Pell's Harbor was gone. Not contained. Gone, the way Marg said it with her mouth flat. But the broadcasts that survived weren't all panic. Some of them were lists, coordinates. A woman's recorded voice looping on a marine band, reading off the locations of people who'd holed up along the coast and couldn't get out. A lighthouse with 6 aboard. A marina office with a family on the roof. A fish processing plant where 40 workers had sealed themselves in the freezers and were running out of air and food in equal measure. The voice read the list and then said, "If anyone can reach the water is the only road left. The roads are gone. The water is the only road." Then the list looped again. The water is the only road. I'd learned that the hard way watching a drowned man walk up my beach, but I'd only learned half of it. The dead used the water as a road to reach me. I had been so busy meeting them at the shoreline that I'd never once turned the thought around. If the water was a road for the dead, it was a road for the living too, and I was the only person I knew of with a working boat, a sheltered harbor, a defensible building, and the fuel to move. I climbed the tower that night and looked at the dark mainland and the 3 or 4 small lights that still burned along the coast, each one a lighthouse full or freezer full of people the radio voice was reading off like a grocery list nobody was shopping from. And I understood that I'd built the wrong kind of safety. I'd built a fortress, a place that took people in and kept them. And a fortress can only ever hold the few it has room for. The cold math of a fortress is always the math of who you turn away. But a harbor is different. A harbor doesn't hold. A harbor moves people through. A harbor's value isn't how high its walls are. It's how many vessels it can shelter for a night before they go on. How much fuel it can pass to a boat with people on its roof. How good its light is. I had spent 5 weeks treating Kestrel as a place to hide. Marg had been right. A wall that only keeps things out is a grave with a view. I came down from the tower at dawn, and I laid it out for the 3 of them at the camp table, Marg, Emmerich, and Soto, who I'd long since stopped pretending was too young to be in the conversations that decided whether we lived. I told them what I wanted to do, and I told them what it would cost, because the cost was the whole point, and I wasn't going to soft-sell it the way Marg had soft-sold Davitt's arm. To become a harbor instead of a fortress, I'd have to undo my own fortifications. The welded door, the jammed boathouse, the whole logic of keep everything out at all had to be reversed. Worse than that, the natural feature that made the lee shelf safe, the long spine of rock I'd been treating as a breakwater that kept strange boats from landing easy, was the exact thing that made it impossible for a damaged vessel to come alongside in any sea above flat calm. To make Kestrel a place a sinking lobster boat full of survivors could actually reach, I'd have to open the harbor, breach my own breakwater, take the rock that protected the lee and blast a channel through it so a boat in trouble could get in. I'd be tearing down the wall that the sea itself had built for me. I'd be making the island reachable by the living, yes, but the living are the ones who come with engines and guns and need, and not all need is gentle. And I'd be turning 4 exhausted people and 1 boat into a transit station for a coastline full of the dying, with no end date and no relief, and no guarantee that any of us would survive the generosity. Emmerich, who had once asked me if I'd do this for other people too, looked at me across the table. "Now you've decided," he said, and he almost smiled. The breakwater was a spine of granite about 90 feet long, the kind of natural mole that coastal people pray for, and I was going to have to take a 40-foot bite out of its middle. I had the acetylene rig, which was useless against rock, and I had 3 cases of commercial blasting agent and a coil of detonating cord that the Coast Guard had left moldering in a magazine bunker behind the station, left because in 1987 it wasn't worth the cost of hauling away, left for me to find 38 years later with a use its original owners never imagined. I'm not a blaster. I'd watched it done on harbor-deepening jobs, and I'd read the 2 manuals in the bunker by lamplight 3 times each. And that was the entirety of my qualification. And Marg told me flatly I was going to kill myself. "Probably," I said. "But if I get it right, the Lighthouse 6 and the Freezer 40 have somewhere to come, and the Maribel has somewhere to bring them. And if I get it wrong, you pull the boat and seal the door, and you go back to the grave with a view. And at least you'll know I tried it before I quit." She didn't have an answer for that. The thing about Marg was she'd spent 19 years going out in weather that should have killed her, for people she didn't know, because the alternative was being the kind of person who didn't. She recognized the disease in me because she'd had it longer. We spent 4 days on the breakwater at low tide, drilling and packing, while Soto kept the tower and Emmerich ran the Maribel in slow circles offshore as a picket against anything the current might bring while we were exposed. It was the most frightened I'd been since the world ended, not of the dead, but of my own incompetence, of the chance that I'd misjudged a charge and brought the whole spine down across the channel instead of opening it. The math of explosives is unforgiving in a way that the math of mercy never is. Mercy you can adjust as you go. A charge you only get to be wrong about once. On the morning we fired it, I sent the others to the far side of the island, and I lit it alone. Because if it went wrong, I wanted it to take 1 person and not 4. I crouched behind the seawall I'd built in my first week, the wall I'd raised to keep the world out. Now my shelter while I blew a door into it, and I turned the key on the blasting machine, and the spine of granite that the sea had spent 10,000 years building lifted and cracked and fell into the channel in a gout of white water and stone dust. And when the spray came down, there was a gap, ragged, ugly, 40 feet of open water where there'd been rock. I'd torn down the wall. The island was reachable now. Anything with an engine and a chart could come straight into the lee and tie up at my pier in any weather short of a gale. I stood in the settling dust, and I felt the 2 things at once that I've never managed to separate since. Triumph, because I'd opened the road, and dread because I'd opened the road. The sea had built me a fortress, and I'd just demolished it on purpose, and there was no welding it shut again. Whatever came for Kestrel now, the dying I meant to save. The living I hadn't met yet, who might come with worse intentions. The dead the tide would keep delivering regardless would come through a door I'd made with my own hands and couldn't unmake. Emmerich found me there. He'd disobeyed and come back early, the way he always disobeyed when it counted. And he stood beside me, looking at the gap in the breakwater and the open water beyond it, running all the way to the burning coast. "It's done," he said. "You can't take it back now." "No," I said. "I can't." "Good," he said. And he meant it, and I'd understood that the boy who'd looked at me like a threat on the pier had become the only one of us who'd never once flinched from the cost of being good. The first run was the Lighthouse 6, because they were closest and because Marg had worked their channel for years and knew the rocks. We went at slack tide before dawn, the Maribel riding low with extra fuel drums, Emmerich on the helm and me on the bow with the boat hook, and the logbook's hard-won knowledge in my head. They go for sound. They track a heartbeat through a wall. They're fast in the first hour. We ran dark and quiet up a coastline I no longer recognized, past a marina where boats burned to the waterline and didn't sink, past a town green where things moved under the streetlights that still, absurdly, came on at dusk. The lighthouse was a horror and a miracle. 6 people had been on its gallery for 18 days, drinking rain and eating gulls, and the dead stood 3 deep around its base in the dark, patient as water, drawn by the heartbeats they couldn't reach. We couldn't fight through 40 of them, and we didn't try. We did what an island taught me. We used the water. Emmerich brought the Maribel under the seaward side where the rocks were worst, and I fired a line up to the gallery with a throw bag. And we took them off one at a time, down a rope into the boat, while the dead pressed at the landward door, and never thought to look at the sea, because the dead, for all their patience, have no imagination. That's the lesson I'd give you if I could only give you one. The dead are relentless, and they are not creative. And everything I ever did to survive them, I did by being creative about the water that they couldn't follow me into. We brought the 6 back to Kestrel through the channel I'd blasted, straight into the lee, tied up at the pier in a freshening breeze that the old breakwater would have made deadly, and the new gap made survivable. They came up the path, a lighthouse keeper named Oduya, who'd refused to leave his post until the people sheltering with him outnumbered the reasons to stay. 2 sisters, an old man who never told us his name, a pregnant woman, and a boy Emmerich's age who attached to Emmerich instantly the way the surviving young do. 11 of us now. The food math, which had been impossible at 5, was now genuinely insane. And here's where the story stops being about whether I could be generous, and starts being about whether generosity, once you've committed to it, will eat you alive. Because the Lighthouse 6 had barely warmed up before the radio gave us the Freezer 40. And then a sailboat with a family clinging to its hull off Sable Point. And then a voice that didn't read coordinates like a list but spoke directly. A man's voice, calm and educated and wrong somehow, who said he represented a community of 70 at the old Naval Reserve, and had heard there was a functioning vessel and a secure harbor operating in the islands, and would like to discuss mutual arrangements. Marg and I looked at each other across the tower when that voice came through. We'd both heard the thing in it that the lighthouse keepers and the freezer workers never had, the thing that wasn't "please help us, but we know what you have." A harbor that takes people through is also a harbor that has fuel, a boat, a defensible building, and a logbook worth more than gold. I'd opened the road for the dying, but a road runs both ways, and I'd known that since the morning a dead man walked up my beach. And I'd blown a hole in my own wall anyway. And now the bill for that decision was hailing me on the marine band in a voice as smooth as oil on calm water. You don't have to answer him, Marg said. No, I said. But he knows we're here now. We've been running the Maribel up and down the coast for 2 weeks. We're not hidden anymore. We stopped being hidden the second I lit that charge. I keyed the mic, and then I let go of it without speaking. Because for the first time since the outbreak, I didn't know what the right words were. And the cold thing in me, and the thing Marg had named the lifeboat thing were, for once, in total agreement that the man on the radio was going to be the death of someone. I didn't answer the man from the Naval Reserve that night. But not answering isn't the same as hiding. And we all knew it. We did the freezer run instead. Because 40 people running out of air is a clock that doesn't care about politics. And it was the worst night of the whole catastrophe. And I'm going to tell it plainly, because David's logbook is the only reason any of them lived. The fish processing plant sat on a commercial pier, and the 40 had sealed themselves into the blast freezers when the town fell. And they'd been in the cold and the dark for 3 weeks, opening the door a crack at dawn for the air that was killing them slow against the dead that would kill them fast. We came in on the Maribel, and a second boat now. We'd recovered a stout aluminum lobster boat from the lighthouse run. And Oduya could run it, which doubled what we could carry. The plan depended on the logbook's hardest lesson. The dead track a heartbeat through a wall, but they track a louder heartbeat harder. We made noise on the wrong pier. Oduya took the aluminum boat to the far end of the commercial waterfront and ran a chainsaw I'd brought for exactly this. Ran it loud against the night, and every dead thing on that waterfront, there were hundreds. I won't pretend at a number. Hundreds turned toward the sound and walked, patient and relentless and utterly without imagination, away from the freezer and toward the noise. And while they walked, Emmerich and I brought the Maribel alongside the freezer pier and got 40 frozen, half-suffocated people down into 2 boats in 11 minutes. And then Oduya cut the saw and pushed off into the dark before the dead could reach the empty pier they'd crowded toward. We lost one. An old woman whose heart simply stopped on the cold steel deck halfway back to Kestrel, who'd survived 3 weeks in a freezer and didn't survive the rescue. And we put her over the side off the lee shelf where we'd put David. And Soto threw a sprig of spruce, because that was our right now. That was the small human thing we did, so the deaths didn't just vanish into arithmetic. 50 of us on the island now. 50. The food was a fiction. The cistern held but 50 people draw it down. The 2 months I'd planned for myself alone had become 2 weeks for 50. And the cold thing in me wasn't whispering anymore. It was screaming. And the worst part was that it was right. I could not feed 50 people. The island could not sustain a harbor and a population at the same time. I'd opened the road to save people, and the saving was going to starve everyone. And that's the trap of mercy that no one warns you about. It doesn't fail by being too small. It fails by being unbounded. It was Oduya, the lighthouse keeper, who showed me the way through, because he'd spent his life being a fixed point that other things moved past. And he understood harbors in his bones the way I understood tides. You're trying to be a fortress and a harbor at the same time, he said. We were on the pier in the gray dawn after the freezer run, both of us too wrung out to sleep. You can't. A fortress holds. A harbor passes through. You blew that channel to make a harbor, so make a harbor. Don't hold these people. Move them. There are islands all down this coast, empty ones, defensible ones, with no boats and no harbors because nobody could reach them. You have boats. You have a harbor. You have a logbook that's worth more than fuel. Kestrel shouldn't be where everybody stays. Kestrel should be where everybody comes through to get fixed up, to get the logbook's knowledge, to get assigned an island they can hold, and then moves on, so the next boatload has room. I stood there in the dawn with 50 mouths and 2 weeks of food, and I felt the whole shape of my mistake and its correction at the same time. I'd torn down a wall to let people in. Now I had to learn the harder thing, to let them out, to not hold them, to make Kestrel valuable not by what it kept, but by what it passed along. We became a transit station in the space of 9 desperate days, and it nearly broke us before it saved us. Oduya and Marg mapped the islands from the charts, and the old lighthouse keeper's memory there were 11 within a day's run that could hold people, that had fresh water or could catch rain, that had a defensible high point and no easy approach. We copied David's logbook by hand, 4 copies, 5. Every group that left taking the knowledge with them. They track a heartbeat through a wall. They go for sound over movement. They're fast for an hour, and then they stiffen. The water is the only road, and the dead can't swim, but the tide will deliver them. So meet them at the shoreline, always at the shoreline. Never let them reach cover. The first island we settled was the Freezer 40, minus the woman we'd lost, onto a steep granite knob with a spring. And we left them with one of the recovered boats, a copy of the logbook, and a VHF set tuned to the channel we now ran as a net. Then the Lighthouse 6, who didn't want to be split, onto a paired island near enough to signal the 40. Each departure made room. Each departure also took a piece out of me, because some of these people I'd bled to save. And now I was sending them back out onto the water that delivered the dead. And Oduya had to remind me more than once that a harbor that won't let go of its boats is just a slower kind of wreck. The man from the Naval Reserve hailed us on the 4th day of the transit work, and this time I answered, because Oduya was right that we weren't hidden, and Marg was right that the man was dangerous, and I decided the only thing more dangerous than talking to him was letting him imagine what we were. His name was Call. He had 70 people, he said, and 3 boats and fuel. And he'd been listening to our net traffic for a week, and he understood that we had something he called the operating knowledge. David's logbook, the routes, the island map. And he proposed, very reasonably, in that oil-on-water voice, that we consolidate, that Kestrel's assets and intelligence come under his coordination, for everyone's efficiency. That I, specifically, bring the logbook and the Maribel to the Naval Reserve to lead the maritime operations. It was a good speech. It was also, underneath, exactly what I'd feared from the first dead man on my beach, and confirmed when I lit the charge. The road I'd opened ran both ways, and here came the living with engines and need. And Call's need wasn't for rescue. Call had 70 people and 3 boats and fuel. Call didn't need saving. Call needed control of the one thing that made survival a system instead of a lottery, the knowledge and the network. And he meant to have it. And his reasonable voice was the voice of a man who'd already decided that 70 organized people with 3 boats could simply take what 11 scattered islands couldn't defend. I'll think about it, I told him, which was a lie, and he knew it was a lie. And his voice when he signed off was a degree colder, and I understood we'd just started a different kind of clock. That night, I sat in the tower with the logbook in my lap and the net crackling with the voices of the islands we'd seeded, the 40 checking in, the 6 checking in, a new sailboat we'd directed to a holding island reporting safe, and I saw the thing Call had missed. The thing that I think saved all of us. And it came to me the way the tide math always came, sideways and complete. Call wanted to consolidate the knowledge so he could control it. He thought the logbook was valuable because it was rare. But I'd already made 4 copies. 5. I'd been giving it away with every boat that left. The knowledge wasn't valuable because it was scarce. I'd spent 9 days making it the opposite of scarce. A thing that everyone has cannot be seized. You can't capture a harbor that has already turned itself into 100 harbors. I hadn't built a fortress for Call to take. without meaning to, by letting go of everyone. I'd built something that had no center left to capture. Call came anyway, of course, because men like Call don't believe a thing can't be seized until they've tried. He came at the end of the second week with 2 of his 3 boats, 20-some armed people, straight through the channel I'd blasted, into the lee, because I'd opened that door and couldn't unmake it. And now the thing I'd feared was tying up at my own pier in the gray afternoon light. I met him on the pier with Marg and Oduya and Emmerich, the 4 of us unarmed and visible, because Oduya had argued me out of the alternative, and he'd been right. You can't outshoot 20, he'd said. But you've already outbuilt him. Let him see what he's actually walked into. So we stood there empty-handed while Call's people fanned out with their rifles. And Call himself came up the pier younger than his voice, neat, with a tired, competent look of a man who'd held 70 people together through hell, and decided that made him the one who got to decide things. Renata Voss, he said. The logbook, the routes, the Maribel. I'd rather this was a partnership. It can still be a partnership. It can't, I said. Not because I won't. Because there's nothing here to partner with. You think I'm the center of a network. I'm not. There is no center. And I told him. I told him about the 4 copies, the 5, the handwritten logbooks on 11 islands, the net that didn't route through Kestrel, but through everyone. The fact that the 40 could direct a sailboat to a holding island without ever calling me. That Oduya's island map existed in a dozen places now. That the knowledge he'd come to seize had been deliberately scattered to the wind for 9 days before he ever arrived. You can take the Maribel, I said. You can take me. You can take this building and the cistern and the last 2 weeks of food. And you'll have taken a pier with a hole blown in the breakwater and a logbook that 50 people already have memorized. There's nothing to consolidate, Call. I gave it all away before you got here. That's the only reason I could afford to open the door. I watched him understand it. I watched the math run behind his eyes the way it ran behind mine. The cold, clean math. And I watched it come up empty for him the way it had come up empty for me on the pier the night the Constance radioed. There was nothing to seize. You cannot capture water that has already become 100 streams. The only thing left to take was the people themselves. And 40 armed strangers can take a building, but they can't take a coastline of islands that each have a boat and the same knowledge and no reason left to fear being alone. Call stood on my pier for a long time. The breeze came through the gap I'd blasted in the breakwater, the gap that had let him in. The gap that had also, I understood now, made the whole thing impossible to hold. Because a harbor you can't seal is a harbor you can't hoard. He could keep me on Kestrel, or he could join the net like everyone else, and get an island and a logbook and a place in the thing I'd accidentally built, which wasn't a kingdom and couldn't be one. You really gave it all away, he said. Not a question. The same flat tone Emmerich had used on the pier 2 months and a lifetime ago. It's the only thing I ever did right, I said. I spent 40 years keeping things a marriage, a grudge, my own brother at arm's length until the water took him. I came out here to keep this rock to myself. And the one time I gave something away instead of keeping it, it turned out to be the only thing that couldn't be taken from me. So yes, I gave it all away. You're welcome to your share. There's an island near Sable Point with a spring and a high point, and nobody on it. I'll mark it on your chart. Call didn't take the island near Sable Point. Men like Call Foe rarely accept a smaller version of what they came for. They'd rather have all of nothing than a portion of something they didn't design. He took 2 drums of my diesel, which I gave him freely because diesel was a thing I could replace and trust was a thing I couldn't. And he ran his boats back out through the gap in the breakwater and onto the gray water. And I never heard his oil-smooth voice on the net again. Months later, a sailboat reported the Naval Reserve gone quiet, gone dark. The way places went when the man holding them together decided that holding them together was beneath him. I don't know what happened to his 70. I think about them. A network that won't let go of its center dies when the center does. And Call was a center. And I had spent 9 frantic days making sure Kestrel never became one. The island settled, again, into something like a life. But it was a different life than the fortress dream I'd come out here chasing. Kestrel was a way station now. Boats came through the gap in the breakwater survivors we'd directed, scouts from the seeded islands, once a Coast Guard cutter with 11 living crew that had been running rescue out of a different stretch of coast and found our net on the Marine Band, and wept, actually wept, to learn there were others doing the same arithmetic of mercy they'd thought they were doing alone. They tied up at my pier, took on water and the logbook and a hot meal and Oduya's island map. And they went on. Always on. That was the discipline of it. The thing Oduya had taught me and I had to relearn weekly. Don't hold them. Move them. A harbor's worth is in what passes through. Soto turned 9 on the island, and we made her a cake out of nothing. Marg's improvisation, ship's biscuit, and the last of the canned fruit, and she spent her birthday in the watchtower because that's where she wanted to be, watching the gap in the breakwater for boats, our small, patient lookout, who'd grown into the job nobody assigned her. Emmerich ran the Maribel on the longer routes now, the dangerous ones, with the new boy from the lighthouse as crew. And he came back from each run a little less full of rage and a little more full of the particular weariness of someone who's chosen over and over to spend himself on strangers. I watched him become me, the better version of me, the version that had skipped the 40 wasted years of keeping things. I want to tell you it felt like victory. It didn't exactly. The dead still came in on the tide they never stopped, not once in all the months, the sea delivering them with the patience of a thing that has all the time in the world. And we still met them at the shoreline, always at the shoreline. And it never got easier to put down something that used to be a person. The food was always a problem. The diesel was always a problem. The net lost islands sometimes, voices going silent on the channel that we'd never get answers about. And we'd say the silent island's name once into the dark, and then never again, our other small right. It was not a happy ending because there was no ending. There was only the work, and the work was endless. And the work was the point. But I slept now. 4 hours, sometimes 5. And when I woke, I knew what the day was for. And there were people who said my name in the morning. And the cold thing in me that had spent 40 years pricing every relationship against its cost had finally found an arithmetic it couldn't argue with, because you cannot lose a thing by giving it away if the giving is the thing itself. I'd come to Kestrel to subtract myself from the world. I'd stayed to become a place the world passed through. I never did figure out how to be safe. I figured out how to be useful, which turned out to be the only safety the end of the world had on offer. The last thing I'll tell you happened on a clear, cold morning in what I think was the 8th month, though we'd long stopped trusting the calendar. A boat came through the gap in the breakwater that I didn't recognize, and the net hadn't announced a small, open skiff, badly handled, riding wrong, the way the Constance had ridden wrong the night this all began. 1 person aboard. I went down to the pier with the boat hook and the old wariness, and Soto called the all clear from the tower because she could see what I couldn't yet. 1 living person, alone, no weapon showing, hands visible on the gunwale. It was a woman about my age, salt-burned and starved down to wire. And she'd come, she said, from 40 miles down the coast, following the net, boat to island to boat. The way the whole ragged system worked now, passed hand to hand down a chain of harbors that each told her where the next one was. She'd heard there was a station on Kestrel that started it. She wanted to see the person who'd started it. Nobody started it, I told her, helping her up onto the pier, and I meant it, because by then it was true. I blew a hole in a breakwater because I was too tired to keep being afraid. Everything after that, everybody did themselves. She looked at me the way people had started looking at me, which I never got used to and never wanted to. And she said, "There's a story going up and down the coast about an island that gave itself away on purpose. People tell it at night on the islands, to the ones who just got there and can't sleep yet. It's the story that makes them believe the net's real, that somebody, somewhere, opened a door instead of welding it shut." She paused. I came to find out if it was true. I thought about the welded door I'd cut into my own head the night I keyed the mic for the Constance. I thought about Davitt thanking me for the dry land, and the logbook built on his death, and the breakwater lifting in white water, and Call's voice going cold when he understood there was nothing to take. I thought about my brother's text, "Come up for air, Ren," the one I never answered, and how this whole rock had become, without my ever planning it, my answer to him 8 months late and given to strangers instead of to him. But an answer, the only one I had. "It's true," I said, "and it's not a story about me. Come up to the building. There's coffee, sort of. There's a logbook you'll want to copy before you go, because you will go. We don't hold people here. That's the whole trick of it. And there's an island near Sable Point with a spring and a high point, and nobody on it. And you look like someone who could hold it. I'll mark it on your chart." She came up the path the dead man had walked, the path Soto's small hand had found mine on the first night, the path 50 saved and seated people had climbed and descended on their way through to somewhere else. The generator was running its steady rhythm. The cistern was full from a week of rain. Marg was teaching the new boy knots in the boathouse, and Oduya was on the net, and Emmerich was somewhere out past the gap in the breakwater, bringing someone home so he could send them on. The sea was bright and cold and indifferent, and it would deliver more dead with the next tide, and we would meet them at the shoreline, always at the shoreline, the way we always did and always would, because the work didn't end, and the work was the point. I'd come 14 miles out into the cold Atlantic to find a wall the world couldn't get past. What I found instead was that the only walls worth a damn are the ones you tear down on purpose, and the only safety that lasts is the kind you give away faster than it can be taken. And that a harbor, unlike a fortress, is measured by everything that leaves it still afloat. I marked her chart. She went on, "That's the whole of it. That's the only ending there is." I keep the logbook still, though there are hundreds of copies now, and mine is no longer special. I keep it because it started as the record of a dying man's gift, and became the record of everything the water taught me, and the most important entry isn't about how the dead move. It's one line I wrote the morning after I blew the breakwater, when my hands still shook and I didn't yet know if I'd doomed us all. A wall keeps you the same. A door changes you into whatever comes through it. I was someone who kept things once. I kept a marriage past its life and a grudge past its use, and my own brother at the length of one unanswered text. And I came out here to keep a rock to myself and disappear behind its concrete. The dead didn't cure me of that. The living did by needing me badly enough that keeping became impossible, and giving became the only math that balanced. I don't know if I'm safe. I stopped asking. I'm reachable now, through a gap I made myself, by anything the tide brings. And that is the most frightened and the most alive I have ever been. I wouldn't weld it shut for the world.